He didn't look at her like a lover. He looked at her like a man assessing a mule for a long winter haul. In the unforgiving winter of 1878, survival wasn't about love. It was about leverage. Clara Halloway had nothing left but her dignity and a thin wool coat, standing in the middle of a snowstorm that threatened to bury her alive. Then came Lucien Mercer, a man rumored to have killed a bear with his bare hands, a man who lived so high up the mountain that God himself probably forgot he existed. He offered her a deal that would change everything, his protection for her motherhood. But as Clara would soon find out, the cold winds of the mountain were the least of her worries. The real danger lay inside the cabin. The wind in Blackwood Ridge didn't just blow, it bit. It chewed through the cracks of the schoolhouse walls and gnawed on the bones of anyone foolish enough to stay indoors without a fire. Clara Halloway stared at the cold, cast-iron stove in the center of the one-room schoolhouse. It was dead, just like her employment. "I'm afraid it's simply a matter of budget, Miss Halloway," Mayor Higgins said, though the glint in his watery eyes suggested otherwise. He stood by the door, wrapped in a buffalo fur coat that cost more than Clara had earned in her entire life. "The town council feels that a woman of your delicate situation is a burden on our resources, without family, without a husband." Clara gripped her reticule tight, her knuckles white. "I have taught these children for 2 years, Mayor. My lack of a husband has never impeded my ability to teach arithmetic." Higgins stepped closer, the smell of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey rolling off him. "But winter is here, and the parsonage needs the room for the new deacon. You have until sunset to vacate." He let the threat hang there. Everyone in the Colorado Territory knew what it meant for a single woman to be homeless in November. It was a death sentence. Or worse, it was an invitation to the brothel down at the saloon on First Street. "Unless," Higgins murmured, his hand reaching out to brush the sleeve of her threadbare grey dress, "you were to find a benefactor. I have a spare room above the livery. Warm. Private." Clara stepped back, repulsion rising in her throat like bile. "I would rather freeze, Mayor." Higgins' face hardened. "Then freeze you shall." He slammed the door, leaving her alone in the deepening chill. Clara didn't cry. Tears froze on cheeks out here. She packed her meager belongings, a Bible, 2 dresses, a locket with a picture of a mother she barely remembered, and a small slate board. By the time she stepped out onto the muddy, snow-packed main street of Blackwood Ridge, the sun was already dipping behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The town was busy. Miners coming down for supplies, trappers trading pelts. Nobody looked at the schoolteacher. In the West, you minded your own business, or you ended up in a pine box. She walked towards the general store, intending to spend her last $3 on dried meat and perhaps a ticket on the next stagecoach, though she knew it wouldn't come for days. The general store was warm, smelling of coffee beans and sawdust. Old Man Miller was behind the counter, weighing flour. He looked up, his face pitying. "Heard the news, Clara. Shame on Higgins." "I need a stage ticket, Mr. Miller," she said quietly. "Lines down due to the storm coming? Be a week, maybe 2. Clara felt the floor sway beneath her. 2 weeks? She couldn't afford a room at the boarding house for 2 nights, let alone 2 weeks. The bell above the door jingled. It wasn't a polite tinkle. It was a violent rattle as the heavy oak door was shoved open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The chatter of 2 miners in the corner ceased instantly. Lucien Mercer filled the doorway. He was a giant of a man, easily 6'4", with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin coat. His beard was dark, thick and unruly, dusted with fresh snow. A scar ran from his left temple down into the beard, jagged and white against his weather-beaten skin. He didn't carry a pistol on his hip. He carried a hunting knife the size of a man's forearm and a repeating rifle slung over his shoulder. He was the Mountain Man. The locals told stories about him, that he was a deserter from the Civil War, that he'd killed a posse of outlaws who tried to take his land, that he ate raw meat. Clara moved aside, pressing herself against the pickle barrel to let him pass. He didn't look at her. He marched to the counter, slamming a heavy sack of furs down. "Supplies," Lucien grunted. His voice was like grinding stones. "Mr." Miller scrambled. "Of course, Lucien, the usual. Flour, salt, bullets." "Double the flour. And candy." Clara blinked. "Candy?" Miller paused. "Candy? For the boys?" Yes. Peppermint. Clara watched him. He was terrifying, primal, and radiating a dangerous energy, but he was buying peppermint for children. As Miller packed the supplies, Lucien turned. He didn't turn casually. He swiveled with the predatory grace of a wolf. His dark eyes, black as coal, scanned the room before landing on Clara. He stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He looked at her worn boots, her shivering hands, the desperate set of her jaw. "You the teacher?" he asked. Clara straightened her spine. "I was. Fired? Evicted." Lucien grunted again. He turned back to Miller. "Add a bag of coffee." Then he looked back at Clara. "You got a man." The miners in the corner gasped. "You didn't just ask a woman that." "That is none of your business, sir," Clara said, her voice shaking only slightly. "It is if I'm gonna hire you," Lucien said. "Hire me?" Lucien took a step toward her. The sheer size of him blocked out the lamplight. "I have 2 sons. Caleb is 10, Jeb is 6. Their mother is gone." A shadow passed over his face, dark and unreadable. "I need someone to cook, clean, and teach 'em to read. They're wilder than badgers." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Go with this man? Into the mountains? It was madness. "I am a school teacher, Mr. Mercer, not a servant. I ain't looking for a servant. I'm looking for a wife." The silence in the store was absolute. Even the fire in the potbelly stove seemed to stop crackling. "Excuse me," Clara whispered. "Town law says I can't hire a live-in woman unless we're wed." "Propriety." He spat the word like it tasted of rot. "I need a mother for my sons. You need shelter. I have a warm cabin, food, and I can promise you Mayor Higgins won't come within 10 miles of my property." He held out a hand. It was calloused, stained with pine pitch and old earth. "It's a business arrangement. Nothing more. You keep the boys alive. I keep you alive." Clara looked at his hand, then at the window where the snow was beginning to fall in thick, heavy sheets. She thought of the mayor's oily smile. She thought of freezing to death in the alley. This man was dangerous. But he was honest. "Do you beat your children, Mr. Mercer?" she asked softly. Lucien's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger sparking. "Never. And you won't touch me? As a wife? I said it's a business arrangement. I keep my word." Clara took a breath that tasted of sawdust and fear. She reached out and placed her small, pale hand into his massive, rough palm. "Then I accept." The wagon ride up the mountain was not a journey. It was an ascent into a different world. Lucien drove the team of 2 massive Clydesdales with silent, effortless competence. The wagon groaned under the weight of supplies and Clara's small trunk. The air grew thinner, colder, and sharper the higher they climbed. They had been married by the Justice of the Peace an hour after the proposal. It had taken 5 minutes. No rings, no vows of love. Just a signature on a piece of paper that bound Clara Halloway to a stranger she feared. "Wrap this around you," Lucien said, breaking the silence that had lasted for 2 hours. He tossed a heavy buffalo robe backward without looking at her. "Thank you," Clara said, pulling the heavy, musky fur up to her chin. "How much farther?" "Far enough that nobody hears you scream." Clara froze. Lucien glanced back, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smirk. "That was a joke, Mrs. Mercer. We're almost there. But the boys, they aren't used to company. Don't show fear. If you show fear, Caleb will eat you alive." "I have handled unruly students before, Mr. Mercer. You ain't handled these." Tunan. The wagon crested a ridge, and the homestead came into view. Clara gasped. She had expected a shack. What she saw was a fortress. The main cabin was massive, built of thick timber logs, with a stone chimney that pumped grey smoke into the sky. There was a barn, a smokehouse, and a high fence surrounding the perimeter. Too high for cattle. It was a fence meant to keep things out. As the wagon rolled into the yard, the front door of the cabin banged open. "Pa!" a small voice yelled. A little boy, barely 6, ran out. He was dressed in oversized wool trousers, held up by a piece of rope, his face smeared with mud and what looked like berry juice. This was Jeb. But behind him, standing in the doorway, was the older one, Caleb. He didn't run. He leaned against the doorframe, holding a whittling knife. He had his father's dark eyes and a scowl that looked etched into his face. He stared at Clara with a hatred so pure it chilled her more than the wind. Lucien hopped down and lifted Jeb up with one arm. Easy, Jeb. Got peppermint. Who's she? Jeb pointed a dirty finger at Clara. Lucien set the boy down and walked to the wagon, offering a hand to Clara. She took it, descending into the slushy mud of the yard. "Boys," Lucien boomed, his voice echoing off the valley walls. "This is Clara. She's staying." "She's a wife, ain't she?" Caleb spoke up. His voice was rough, cracking with puberty. "Like the last one?" Clara looked at Lucien sharply. The last one? He hadn't mentioned a last one. He said their mother was gone. Lucien's jaw tightened. "Caleb, watch your mouth! She won't last the winter," Caleb spat. He turned and drove his whittling knife deep into the doorframe, leaving it quivering there, before disappearing inside the dark house. "Welcome home," Lucien muttered, grabbing her trunk. The inside of the cabin was warm but chaotic. Animal pelts were piled in corners. Dishes were stacked high on a rough-hewn table. A rifle lay on the mantel. It smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and pine. "Your room is the loft," Lucien said, pointing to a ladder. "Boys sleep in the back room. I sleep down here by the door." To guard it, Clara realized. "I will start dinner," Clara said, trying to establish some normalcy. She took off her coat, revealing her simple grey dress. She rolled up her sleeves. "Where is the pump?" "Indoor pump. Kitchen," Lucien said, watching her. He seemed surprised she was taking initiative. Clara found the kitchen, a disaster zone of flour spills and grease. She set to work. She needed to prove her worth immediately. If she was useful, she was safe. By the time the sun set, she had scrubbed the table and made a simple stew with the dried meat and potatoes she found. They ate in silence. Jeb shoveled food into his mouth with his hands until Clara gently placed a spoon in his grip. He looked at her like she had handed him a live snake, but he used it. Caleb just glared. "So," Caleb said, breaking the silence, "where are you from? The city?" "I am from Boston, originally," Clara said. "They die easy in Boston," Caleb smirked. "That is enough," Lucien growled. He looked at Clara. "The boys need schooling, starting tomorrow, but tonight, lock the loft hatch." Clara looked at him, confused. "Why?" "Because," Lucien said, leaning forward, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "Sometimes the wolves get brave and scratch at the roof, and sometimes Caleb likes to play tricks with spiders." Clara swallowed hard. She finished her meal, excused herself, and climbed the ladder. The loft was small, freezing, but clean. There was a narrow bed with a straw tick mattress. She sat on the edge, listening to the wind howl outside. Below, she heard the heavy bar drop across the main door. She heard Lucien murmuring something to the boys, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. Then she heard Caleb's voice, loud enough for her to hear through the floorboards. "She's hiding something, Pa. I saw her boots. They got fancy stitching on the inside. She ain't a poor teacher. She's running from something." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. She looked down at her boots, the one remnant of the life she had fled 3 years ago. The life where she wasn't Clara Halloway. Lucien's voice rumbled below. "We're all running from something, son. Question is, who catches up first?" Clara blew out the candle, plunging herself into darkness. She lay back, listening to the house settle. She was safe from the cold, safe from the mare. But as she closed her eyes, she realized she was trapped in a house with a man who killed with his hands, a boy who saw too much, and secrets that were bound to bleed out like a fresh wound in the snow. Outside, a wolf howled. Inside, Clara prayed. The first week passed, not in days, but in tasks. Survival on the mountain was a relentless, grinding cycle. Clara learned quickly that being a school teacher held no currency here. The mountain didn't care if you could recite Shakespeare. It only cared if you could chop wood before the frost set in. Morning came before the sun did. Clara woke to the sound of Lucien moving downstairs, the heavy thud of his boots, the metallic clack-clack of the rifle lever being checked. By the time she climbed down the ladder, the cabin was freezing. The fire had died down to embers, and a layer of ice had formed over the water in the wash basin. Lucien was already at the door, wrapped in his furs. He paused, his hand on the latch. "Don't go past the fence line," he said, not looking at her. "Cougar tracks near the barn." "Will you be back for the midday meal?" Clara asked, clutching her shawl tight. "If the mountain allows." And then he was gone, swallowed by the grey dawn, The days were a battle of wills, not with the elements, but with Caleb. The 10-year-old was a phantom in the house. He watched her with a predator's patience. When she cooked, he sat at the table, whittling a stick, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. He wouldn't eat the oatmeal she made until he saw Jeb eat it first. "It's time for lessons," Clara announced on the 4th day. She wiped the table clean and set down her slate board. "Jeb, sit here. Caleb, put the knife away." Jeb scrambled onto the bench. He was starved for attention, and Clara's gentle voice was a balm to him. But Caleb didn't move. "I know how to read," Caleb muttered, slicing a curl of wood off the stick. "Pa taught me. Reading is not enough. You need arithmetic, history. You need to know the world beyond this ridge," Caleb sneered. "Why, the world down there is full of liars and thieves. Pa says so. Your father is a wise man, but he cannot teach you everything," Clara said firmly. She reached out to take the knife. Caleb's hand snapped out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was shockingly strong for a child. His fingers were rough, dirt embedded deep in the skin. "Don't touch me," he hissed. Clara didn't pull away. She held his gaze, her heart pounding, but her face calm. "I am not the enemy, Caleb. Ain't you?" He released her, but his eyes dropped to her wrist. The sleeve of her dress had pulled up slightly. There, fading but still visible against her pale skin, was a bruise. It wasn't fresh, but it was ugly, the shape of a thumbprint. Caleb stared at it. "Who gave you that?" Clara quickly pulled her sleeve down. "That is none of your concern." "Pa doesn't hit women," Caleb said, his voice lowering. "So you brought that with you. From the city." "Open your primer, Caleb," Clara commanded, her voice trembling slightly. The tension broke only because the front door banged open. Lucien entered. He brought the cold with him, and the smell of copper. He was dragging a carcass, a massive elk, its antlers scraping the floorboards. Blood trailed behind him on the wood. Clara gasped, stepping back. Lucien stopped, breathing hard, steam rising from his beard. He looked at Clara, then at the blood on his floor. For a moment she thought he would apologize. "Water!" he barked. "Boil it. Lots of it." He hauled the elk toward the kitchen table. "Caleb, get the skinning knives. Jeb, get the buckets." He looked at Clara. She was pressed against the wall, her face white. "You wanted to be a mountain wife, Clara," Lucien said, his voice grim. "This is it. I need hands to dress the meat before it spoils or the smell draws the bears. Can you do it, or do I send you back to the mayor?" Clara looked at the dead animal. Its glass eyes seemed to stare at her. She felt the bile rise. She had never seen anything die, let alone butchered. But she remembered the mayor's face. She remembered the cold of the alley. She took a breath, smoothed her apron, and stepped forward. "Tell me what to do." For the next 4 hours, the schoolhouse was forgotten. The cabin became a slaughterhouse. Lucien worked with surgical precision, peeling the hide back, separating muscle from bone. He didn't speak, but he watched her. He watched as Clara, trembling, held the heavy limbs. He watched as her hands, meant for holding chalk and turning pages, became covered in warm, slick blood. She gagged once when the stomach was removed, but she didn't leave. She hauled the buckets of offal to the back door. She scrubbed the table until her knuckles were raw. By sunset, the meat was salted and hanging in the smokehouse. The cabin was scrubbed clean, smelling of lye soap and pine again. Clara sat by the fire, exhausted down to her bones. She stared at her hands. No matter how much she scrubbed, she felt like the red was still there. Lucien walked over. He held 2 tin cups. He handed one to her. "Whiskey," he said. "Just a sip. It kills the chill." Clara took it. Her hands shook. She took a sip. It burned like fire, but it settled her stomach. "You did good," Lucien said. It was the first compliment he had given her. He sat in the chair opposite her, stretching his long legs out. Most women from the city. They faint at the sight of the gut pile. "My first wife, Sarah." He trailed off. Clara looked up. "Caleb said she left." Lucien's eyes darkened. He looked into his cup. "Caleb says a lot of things. Sarah didn't have your spine, Clara. The mountain broke her long before she died. She just stopped trying." He looked at her, his gaze intense and searching. "You're running from something hard, Clara. A woman with soft hands who can gut an elk without crying has seen worse than blood." Clara gripped the cup. "We agreed, Lucien. A business arrangement, no questions." "I ain't asking," Lucien rumbled. "I'm just warning you. Whatever is chasing you, if it comes up this mountain, it deals with me." Clara felt a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't love. It was too soon, too cold for that. But it was a feeling of safety. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't the only one holding the door shut against the wolves. "Thank you," she whispered. From the shadows of the loft ladder, Caleb watched them. He fingered the piece of paper he had stolen from Clara's trunk while they were butchering the elk. It was a letter, the ink smudged, but the address was clear. Mrs. Clara Scott. Boston. Scott, Caleb whispered to himself, not Halloway. He slipped the letter into his pocket. Winter in the Rockies does not give warnings. It strikes. 2 weeks after the elk kill, the sky turned a bruised purple. The birds stopped singing. The silence that fell over the valley was heavy, pressing against the eardrums. "Nor'easter," Lucien said, looking out the window. He was sharpening his axe, a big one. "We need more wood." They spent the afternoon frantically preparing. Clara helped stack logs against the cabin walls, insulation and fuel. They brought the goats into the small lean-to attached to the kitchen. They barred the shutters. By nightfall, the world was gone. There was only white. The wind screamed like a banshee, shaking the heavy timbers of the cabin until the dust fell from the rafters, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the fear rising inside. It started with a cough. Jeb had been sluggish all day, his cheeks flushed. By dinner, his breathing had changed. It wasn't a wheeze, it was a rasping, barking sound, like a seal. Lucien froze mid-bite when he heard it. He dropped his spoon and went to the boy. He placed a massive hand on Jeb's forehead. "He's burning," Lucien said, his voice tight with a panic Clara hadn't thought him capable of. "It's croup," Clara said, recognizing the sound immediately from her day's teaching. "Or lung fever. We need steam. Keep the fire high." Within hours, the cabin became a sick room. The wind howled outside, burying them in snow, making travel to the town doctor impossible. They were on their own. Jeb's condition deteriorated rapidly. His throat was closing up. He thrashed on the bed, gasping for air, his little face turning blue. "He can't breathe!" Lucien yelled, terror cracking his stoic facade. He picked the boy up, pacing the floor, rocking him. "Breathe, Jeb! Come on, son, fight it!" Clara took charge. The poor teacher vanished, replaced by a woman of steel. "Lucien, put him down! You're squeezing him!" she ordered. "He's dying!" Lucien roared at her, his eyes wild. "Just like Sarah!" Clara grabbed Lucien by the shoulders. She had to look up to meet his eyes, but she didn't flinch. "He is not dying. Not tonight. Fill the kettle, get the blankets, create a tent over the bed. We need to concentrate the steam." Lucien stared at her, seeing the absolute certainty in her eyes. He obeyed. They built a tent of buffalo robes over the bed. Lucien kept the kettle boiling, shoving pot after pot of steaming water under the tent. Clara climbed in with Jeb. It was suffocatingly hot under the firs. Clara held the boy upright, rubbing his back, singing soft lullabies that she hadn't sung since before. "Lavender's blue, dilly, dilly, lavender's green." Outside the tent, Lucien paced. He felt useless. He could kill a bear. He could build a house, but he couldn't fight this enemy. He couldn't shoot a fever. Caleb sat in the corner, his knees pulled to his chest. He looked small. He watched his father pace. "Is he gonna die, Pa?" Caleb whispered. Lucien stopped. He looked at his eldest son. No, she won't let him. Hours dragged on. The storm raged. Inside the tent, Clara was drenched in sweat. Her arms ached from holding Jeb up. Every time his breathing hitched, her heart stopped. Sometime around 3 a.m., the barking cough softened. Jeb's breathing grew deeper, slower. The fever broke. Clara slumped against the headboard, exhausted. She carefully laid Jeb down and crawled out of the tent. She emerged into the cooler air of the cabin, hair plastered to her face, dress soaked with sweat. She looked like a wraith. Lucien was waiting. He was sitting in the chair, a cup of water in his hand. He looked at her as if she were an angel. "He's sleeping," Clara whispered. "The worst is over." Lucien let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He stood up and crossed the room in 2 strides. Before Clara could react, he pulled her into a hug. It wasn't romantic. It was desperate. It was the embrace of a man who had almost lost his world and had been pulled back from the edge. He buried his face in her hair, smelling of steam and lavender. "Thank you," he rumbled into her neck. "God, Clara. Thank you." Clara stood stiffly for a moment. Then she softened. She raised her arms and hesitantly hugged him back. He was solid, warm, and trembling. "I promise to keep them alive," she said softly. Lucien pulled back, his hands gripping her upper arms. He looked down at her. The barrier between them, the employer and employee, had thinned. "You saved him," Lucien said. "Sarah. She died of the lung fever. 4 years ago. The storm trapped us then, too." I sat there and watched her drown in her own chest. I couldn't save her. He looked towards the sleeping boy. "I thought God was coming, for Jeb, to punish me." "Punish you for what?" Clara asked gently. Lucien looked at her, his eyes haunted. "For what I did during the war. For the men I didn't save." The wind rattled the door, a reminder that the world outside was still hostile. "We all have ghosts, Lucien," Clara said, reaching up to touch his arm. "But we are the living, and tonight we won." Lucien looked at her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. The air between them shifted, charged with something new. Acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps the seed of something dangerous. Suddenly, a creak from the loft ladder broke the moment. They pulled apart. Caleb was standing there. He had seen the hug. He had seen the look in his father's eyes. "Jeb okay?" Caleb asked, his voice flat. "He's fine, son," Lucien said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness. "Go back to sleep." Caleb nodded, but he didn't move his eyes from Clara. There was no gratitude in them, only calculation. He turned and climbed back up. Clara shivered, the sweat on her skin turning cold. She looked at Lucien. "I should rest." "Take my bed," Lucien said. "It's closer to the fire. I'll take the floor by the door." Clara didn't argue. She was too tired. She lay down on Lucien's bed. It smelled of tobacco, leather, and him. It was the most comforting smell she had ever known. As she drifted off, she didn't know that upstairs, Caleb had lit a small candle. He pulled the stolen letter out of his pocket. He looked at the name, Mrs. Clara Scott. Then he opened the locket he had swiped from her trunk earlier that day. Inside, there was a picture of a man in a fine suit, and on the opposite side, a tiny lock of blonde hair. Not a baby's hair, a man's hair, and an inscription, "To my beloved Clara, until death parts us." "Scott," Caleb whispered. He had heard that name before. In the newspapers, Old Man Miller used to rap fish. "The Scott Diamond Heist. Boston. Husband murdered. Wife missing. Wanted for questioning." Caleb blew out the candle. Darkness returned, but now he held the match. The blizzard broke 2 days later, leaving the mountain entombed in silence. The world was a blinding, undulating ocean of white, broken only by the black spikes of pine trees. Inside the cabin, the air had shifted. The desperate urgency of Jeb's fever had been replaced by a fragile, domestic quiet. Clara stood by the wash basin, scraping the last of the dough from her fingers. Sunlight, sharp and dazzling off the snow, streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She felt a strange sense of peace. Jeb was sitting up in bed, weak but breathing clear, whittling a piece of soft pine Lucien had brought him. The door opened and Lucien entered. He stomped the snow from his boots, the vibration running through the floorboards and up Clara's legs. He wasn't wearing his heavy coat. He was in his undershirt and suspenders, his skin flushed from chopping wood. He looked at her. It wasn't the assessment of a mule anymore. It was the look of a man seeing water after a long walk in the desert. "Wood's stacked," he said, his voice rough. "Road might be passable by tomorrow. I'll take the wagon down to the lower ridge, check the trap line." "Is it safe?" Clara asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Safe enough. We need fresh meat. The elk is mostly smoked." He walked over to the basin, standing close to her. Too close. She could smell the cold air clinging to his skin and the scent of cedar. He reached past her for the soap. His arm brushed hers. Clara stopped breathing for a second. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "About the other night. You don't have to speak of it, Lucien. I do." He turned to face her, water dripping from his hands. "I haven't thanked a woman for saving a life in this house before. Usually I'm the one burying them." Clara looked up into his dark eyes. She saw the vulnerability there, buried under layers of granite and scar tissue. She had an overwhelming urge to touch the scar on his cheek, to trace the line of pain he carried. "You are a good father, Lucien. That is all that matters." Lucien held her gaze for a moment longer, the tension stretching tight between them, thicker than the molasses in the pantry. Then he nodded once, abruptly, and turned to splash water on his face. "Keep the door barred while I'm gone," he said, the moment broken. "Don't open it for anyone but me." He grabbed his rifle, threw on his heavy coat, and left. The silence he left behind was heavy. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She turned to check on Jeb. "I'm hungry," the boy rasped, smiling at her. "I'll make cornbread." Clara smiled back. "I'll help," a voice said from the ladder. Caleb descended. He moved differently today. There was no sulking, no scuffing of feet. He moved with a terrifying adult purpose. He walked past the kitchen table and stood by the fireplace, watching the flames lick the soot-stained bricks. "Pa likes you," Caleb said. He didn't look at her. Clara paused, the mixing bowl in her arm. "I hope he tolerates me, Caleb. We are a team." "No," Caleb turned. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his face, making him look older than 10. "He likes you. He looks at you the way he used to look at Ma before she got sick. He thinks you're safe." Clara set the bowl down. "Caleb, what is this about?" Caleb reached into his pocket. He pulled out two things, the locket and the letter. Clara felt the blood drain from her face so fast she had to grip the table to keep from falling. The room seemed to tilt. "You went through my things," she whispered. "You lied," Caleb said. He held up the letter. "Mrs. Clara Scott, Boston. Wanted for questioning in the death of Richard Scott. Diamond merchant." Caleb took a step closer. "You didn't just run from a debt, lady. You're a killer." "No," Clara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Caleb, please. You don't understand." "I understand enough," the boy spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of triumph and fear. "I read the papers in town. Richard Scott was found with a letter opener in his neck. His wife vanished with a pouch of uncut stones. He was going to kill me," Clara cried out, her voice cracking. She looked at Jeb, who was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. She lowered her voice, stepping toward Caleb. "He was a monster, Caleb. A devil in a silk suit. He beat me until I couldn't stand. That night, he had a gun. It was him or me." "And the diamonds?" Caleb asked coldly. "I took them to survive, to get as far away as possible," Clara pleaded. "I haven't spent a dime of it. They are at the bottom of the river in St. Louis. I just wanted to disappear." "You brought the law to our door," Caleb said. He shoved the letter back into his pocket. "Pa has secrets too. Bad ones. From the war. If the law comes here looking for you, they find him. They find us." The boy's protectiveness over his father was a jagged, violent thing. He didn't care about the morality of what she had done. He cared that she was a lightning rod standing in the middle of his home. "Caleb, listen to me." "No," Caleb interrupted. "You listen. Pa is finally happy. I ain't seen him sleep through the night in years until you got here. If I tell him who you are, it'll break him. He'll have to turn you in. It's the code." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "What do you want?" Caleb's eyes were hard. "Leave." "What?" "Pack your bag. When the snow melts on the pass, you take the wagon to town for supplies, and you don't come back. You keep going." "I can't," Clara whispered. "I have nowhere to go. And Jeb, he needs me." "Jeb needs a father who ain't in prison for harboring a fugitive," Caleb snapped. "You have 1 week. If you're still here by the next full moon, I show Pa the letter." He turned and walked to the door, grabbing his coat. "I'm going to chop wood. Don't burn the cornbread." The door slammed. Clara sank into the chair, her legs giving way. She buried her face in her hands. She had survived the blizzard, the fever, and the mountain. But she couldn't survive the truth. From the bed, Jeb's small voice piped up. "Miss Clara, are you crying?" Clara wiped her face aggressively, forcing a smile that felt like glass. "No, sweetie, just smoke in my eyes." But as she looked at the little boy, she knew the countdown had begun. She had fallen in love with this broken family, and now, to save them, she had to break them all over again. 4 days passed. The snow receded into slushy patches of grey mud. The world was waking up, but Clara felt like she was walking to the gallows. She avoided Lucien. She couldn't bear to look at him, knowing she was lying to him with every breath. Lucien noticed. He became quieter, his movements around her more tentative, confused by her sudden withdrawal after the intimacy of the storm. On the 5th day, the dogs started barking. It wasn't the playful bark they gave the squirrels. It was the low, guttural snarl reserved for intruders. Lucien was in the barn, mending a harness. Clara was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She froze. Down the valley road, a rider was approaching. He didn't look like the locals. The men of Blackwood Ridge rode heavy cobs or mules, dressed in furs and wool. This man rode a tall, sleek, black Hanoverian, a city horse. He wore a long, oilskin duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that silhouette. She had seen it in her nightmares. Lucien emerged from the barn. He held a pitchfork, but his hand hovered near the Colt revolver on his hip. He walked to the gate, placing himself between the house and the road. The rider slowed and stopped 10 yards from the gate. The horse huffed, steam rising from its nostrils. The stranger tipped his hat. He was handsome in a sharp, reptilian way. Clean-shaven, pale skin, and eyes that looked like polished flint. "Good afternoon," the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, Boston accent. "Afternoon," Lucien rumbled. He didn't open the gate. "You're lost, stranger. Main road is 5 miles east." "I'm not lost, Mr. Mercer. Is it Mr. Mercer?" Lucien's eyes narrowed. "It is." "My name is Arthur Kincaid. I'm a private investigator, working for the Pinkerton Agency." Clara, standing in the shadow of the porch overhang, felt her knees buckle. She pressed herself flat against the wood, praying the shadows would swallow her. Lucien didn't flinch. "Law has no business here. I pay my taxes." "Oh, it's not about taxes," Kincaid smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for a woman. She's been missing from the east for some time. We received a tip from a stagecoach driver in Denver that a woman matching her description bought a ticket to Blackwood Ridge." Kincaid pulled a photograph from his coat. "Petite, blonde, goes by the name Clara, or perhaps Mrs. Scott." Lucien stood like a statue. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't give anything away, but his grip on the pitchfork tightened until his knuckles were white. "Don't know her," Lucien lied. The lie was smooth, easy. "Is that so?" Kincaid's gaze drifted past Lucien, scanning the cabin, the porch, the windows. "Because the town mayor, a Mr. Higgins, mentioned you hired a new wife recently. A teacher." "My wife is named Clara Mercer," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "And she ain't who you're looking for. Now turn that horse around before I spook it." Kincaid chuckled softly. He adjusted his gloves. "Mr. Mercer, the woman I'm looking for is wanted for grand larceny and the murder of a prominent businessman. If you are harboring her, that makes you an accessory. And given your history in the war, I don't think you want federal attention." Lucien took a step forward. The threat was palpable. "Get off my land." Kincaid held up a hand. All right. I'll be going. But I'll be in town for a few days. If you remember anything, or if you realize that sleeping next to a murderess is bad for your health, come find me." He wheeled his horse around and trotted away, his back straight, arrogant. Lucien watched him go until he disappeared around the bend. Then he turned. He marched to the porch. He didn't look at Clara. He walked past her, threw the pitchfork down, and went inside. Clara followed him, trembling. Lucien stood in the middle of the room. Caleb was at the table, his face pale. He had heard everything. "Lucien," Clara began, her voice a whisper. Lucien spun around. His face was a mask of fury and betrayal. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Lucien, please let me explain. Is it true?" His voice shook the rafters. "Did you kill a man?" "He was hurting me!" Clara screamed, the tears finally falling. "He was going to kill me. It was self-defense." "And the theft?" Lucien asked, his voice icy. "I needed money to run. I never spent it. I swear on my life, Lucien." Lucien ran a hand over his face, pacing the room. "A Pinkerton. You brought a Pinkerton to my door. Do you know what they do? They burn everything down until they get what they want. He looked at Caleb. "Did you know?" Caleb looked down at the table. I found a letter. A week ago." Lucien stared at his son. "And you didn't tell me?" "I wanted her to leave," Caleb yelled, standing up. "I told her to leave so you wouldn't get hurt. I didn't want you to go to jail, Pa." The room fell silent. Lucien looked from his terrified son to the weeping woman who had saved his youngest boy's life. He walked over to the window, watching the road where Kincaid had vanished. "He's not gone," Lucien said quietly. "Men like that don't leave. He's going to circle back. He's going to watch us." He turned to Clara. "You're my wife. Paper says so. In the eyes of the law, and the eyes of this mountain, you are mine." Clara looked at him, hope fragile in her chest. "Lucien?" "But I can't have a liar raising my sons," he said, his voice breaking. "Pack your things, Clara." Clara sobbed. "Lucien, please. Pack," he roared, slamming his hand on the table. "We leave at first light. I'm taking you to the train station in Silverton. I'll get you on a train west. San Francisco. He won't look for you there." You're helping me?" Clara asked. "I'm getting you out of my life," Lucien said, his eyes hard, "before you get my boys killed." He grabbed his coat. "I'm sleeping in the barn. Caleb, lock the door." Lucien walked out into the cold twilight. Clara stood in the middle of the room, her heart shattering. She was being saved, yes, but she was losing the only home she had ever really wanted. And outside, in the darkening woods, Arthur Kincaid sat on his horse, watching the cabin through a brass spyglass. He smiled. He didn't want the woman on a train. He wanted the diamonds, and he knew that to get them, he would have to burn the mountain man's fortress to the ground. The night did not pass in peace. At 2 a.m., the smell of kerosene cut through the cold air. Clara woke with a start, coughing as grey smoke curled under the doorframe. "Boys, wake up!" she screamed, scrambling from the bed. She grabbed Jeb, hauling him from his sleep, and shook Caleb awake. "Fire! Get out the back window!" But as they reached the kitchen, the back door shattered inward. Arthur Kincaid stood there, framed by the orange glow of the burning porch. He held a revolver, and his face was twisted in a manic grin. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Scott?" "Get behind me," Clara hissed to the boys, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. "Where is he?" Kincaid sneered, stepping over the shattered wood. "The mountain man?" "Right here," a voice roared. Kincaid spun around. Lucien had smashed through the front window, glass raining down around him. He was covered in soot. Kincaid had barred the barn door to burn him alive, but Lucien had kicked his way out through the rotting back wall. Kincaid fired. The bullet tore through Lucien's shoulder, spinning him around. Lucien hit the floor hard. "No!" Clara screamed. Kincaid aimed the gun at Lucien's head. "The diamonds, Clara! Now! Or the Widowmaker dies!" Clara didn't hesitate. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the small velvet pouch that had been the source of all her nightmares. "Take it!" she cried, tossing the pouch across the room. Kincaid's eyes followed the arc of the velvet. Greed overtook his training. He reached out with his free hand to catch it. In that split second of distraction, a small shadow moved. Caleb lunged from behind Clara. He didn't have a gun. He had his whittling knife. With a scream of pure rage, he drove the blade into Kincaid's thigh. Kincaid howled, the gun discharging wildly into the ceiling. He backhanded Caleb, sending the boy flying against the wall. But the distraction was enough. Lucien was up. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a bear. He tackled Kincaid, the force of the impact shaking the cabin. The two men crashed into the table, splintering wood and overturning the oil lamp. The fire from the lamp ignited the spilled kerosene instantly. A wall of flame separated Clara and the boys from the men fighting on the floor. "Lucien!" Clara screamed. A gunshot rang out, then silence. Through the dancing flames, a figure stood up. He was breathing hard, clutching his shoulder. "Lucien!" He stepped through the fire, stomping out the flames with his heavy boots. He looked at Clara, then at Caleb, who was groaning on the floor. Lucien walked over to Kincaid's body, retrieved the velvet pouch from the dead man's grip, and looked at it. The diamonds inside were worth a fortune. Enough to build a mansion. Enough to run forever. Lucien looked at Clara. "You kept these? To run?" "I kept them to survive," Clara wept, holding Caleb. "But I don't want them. I never wanted them." Lucian walked to the open cast-iron stove where the coals were glowing red-hot. He held the pouch over the heat. "Then let them burn," Lucian growled. "No," Clara gasped. But then she stopped. She looked at Lucian, bleeding for her. She looked at Caleb, who had fought for her. "Burn them," she whispered. Lucian tossed the pouch into the stove and slammed the iron door shut. He walked over to Clara and sank to his knees, wrapping his good arm around her and the boys. "The train leaves at dawn," Lucian rasped, pressing his forehead against hers. "But you aren't on it." "I'm not." "No," Lucian said, looking at Caleb. "Caleb? Does she stay?" Caleb wiped blood from his lip. He looked at Clara, then at the bruise on her wrist, then at his father. "She ain't a teacher," Caleb grunted. "She fights too dirty for a teacher." He looked Clara in the eye. She stays." The snow began to fall again outside, covering the tracks, covering the body they would bury deep in the woods, and covering the past. Clara Halloway was dead. Clara Mercer was home. And so, under the cover of the great blizzard of 1878, the secrets of Blackwood Ridge were buried forever. The diamonds that could have bought a city were lost to the fire, but Clara found something far more valuable, a family that would kill to protect her, and a love that was stronger than the cold. Some say that if you go up to the old Mercer homestead today, you can still find melted glass in the ruins of the old stove, diamonds turned to nothing but scarred memories. What do you think? Did Clara make the right choice, throwing away a fortune for a hard life in the mountains? Or was she crazy to trust a man she hardly knew? If you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and romance, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And share this video with a friend who loves a good drama. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.